Well, hello everybody. I want to do this video on what we've seen in COP28 yesterday and all the delegations Canada sent, which were many and massive. Hundreds of Canadian elites, hundreds of them went to COP28 in Dubai. USA President Joe Biden didn't go. He canceled as his polls have tanked, as well as he can't enter into carbon tax because he needs the Congress and Senate. Specifically, the Congress is in charge of that. The Congress doesn't want to go that route because Americans won't accept it. Russia doesn't implement carbon tax. They're not doing it, which overlaps Canada. Canada and Russia have something that no other country in the world has, and that's an overabundance of boreal forests. We have the Arctic Circle. We have two neighbors. We have the United States of America and Russia. We share our borders. And on the flip side of Canada and Russia, there's a mass amount of boreal forests that don't even come close to how much Canada has, even though that's a whopping percentage too. It's almost 50% of all forests found in the world are split between Canada and the Russian Federation. Now Vladimir Putin says, listen, he stated that more than 6 years ago now, we will never implement any carbon pricing or carbon taxation on the Russian people or involve ourselves in global carbon pricing schemes, transfers of wealth, because Russia is net zero. The Russian people own all the forests. We, the people of the fatherland of Russia, that's the Constitution of Russia. In Canada, it's not how it works. We are limited as Canadians to 9% of this country and all First Peoples to your reserves that are 0.2% of Canada. That's it. Those massive crown lands and those massive boreal forests are clearly stated in the constitutional acts of Canada and all the provincial executive constitutions that they belong to the provincial crown and the federal crown, and all those elected and appointed into the crown. Not any class of subjects known as second and third. It's none of yours. So Charles and all the kingdoms, including Greta Thunberg, who I tagged in this too, along with King Charles, they were COP28. They never ever once mentioned in all of COP28 in Dubai that Canada is home to 318 billion trees, are massive boreal forests that represent 30% of all global forestation in the world. And there's only 40 million of us in Canada. It works out to almost 10,000 trees for every man, woman, and child, Canadian and first person. That's how many trees each Canadian is represented by. So much trees, in fact, we're carbon negative. Not only do we capture all the carbon produced in Canada, we capture a lot more of the world's carbon production. But you see, Canada doesn't narrate us in the same legal terms as other nations in the world, specifically other nations like the United States of America, the Russian Federation, and Communist China. That's right. Communist China says it belongs to all the Chinese people. And for those who don't know, another 7% is represented by China. And even at their whopping nearly 1.5 billion people, their carbon capture is nearly carbon negative. You start looking around the world at deforestation and nations in the world like the United Kingdom, they don't have hardly any forests left. Tiny little island with massive per person carbon production. They say that doesn't matter. We're going to tax everybody the same globally on the actual lands that are private in their name. And that's what they're doing. We watch carbon expression in COP28, where Canada sent the most delegates of any nation worldwide. The most. Canada sent hundreds. Not only the federal delegation that was bloated, but each and almost every province sent a massive delegation of their own, selling their baloney. We're in really big trouble here because it was Conservatives, Liberal, NDP, all jointly represented. In fact, the most expensive delegation per person per capita goes to Scott Moe in the province of Saskatchewan. They sent a massive amount of delegates and literally many millions. When you look at the withdrawal out of the Provincial Consolidated Fund of Saskatchewan, the pay scale for provincial politicians elected or appointed, and all those underneath them, it worked out to $2.62 for every Saskatchewanian. It was $1.26 higher than the federal delegation. Pretty scary stuff. Think about that in millions of dollars. What was it for? Not one delegate from the federal or provincial crowns across the board, Conservative, Liberal, NDP, ever once spoke up about the 318 billion trees in Canada. When you look at the two provinces, Ontario and Quebec, a massive major share of forestation, those two major provinces, literally 91% of both Ontario and Quebec is forest and forest alone. They only hold slivers of private property where they compress the most Canadians in the smallest amount of private property in all of Canada. You can't go anywhere else in Canada besides British Columbia, the Greater Vancouver, and find such density and such limited amount of private property available to anyone in Canada, let alone the world. It's sick, considering literally 91% of this country is not available to us. And it's also excluded from the carbon pricing, carbon taxation schemes. They erased the 318 trees. In fact, Ontario presented and they slammed the city of Toronto, and they're talking about the charges they're going to put on the people of Toronto and the GTA on the 800 trees they're planning to cut down in Ontario Place as they redevelop it, and literally billions and billions of trees for 16 million Ontarians. So many trees, in fact, there is hardly any farmland at all available for Ontarians. Per person per capita, they have the smallest amount of available self-sustaining farmland than anywhere else in Canada. Not a word was mentioned, only that they had to increase taxation against all farmers, specifically Alberta and Saskatchewan, who hold the most farmland in all of Canada. That Alberta and Saskatchewan farmers would pay the most. The clapping and the ovation as Charles spoke and other delegates from Saskatchewan and Alberta's delegations was absolutely pathetic. So anyone talking about Scott Moe or Danielle Smith and their major delegations being somehow with the people and with the narratives being told in the conservative side of politics, it's an absolute fabrication. Because I promise you, the IMF International Maritime Organization, IMO, not the fund, the organization, passed by both Democrats and Republicans, the Russian Federation and the People's Republic of China, as well as the United Kingdom and France, binding law, places major changes on our fuel shipping worldwide. The Canada hasn't changed, and what Canada holds of our international shipping of imports and exports isn't transformed at all. Instead, they're going to bill all Canadians in the second and third class against the IMO, and that way they're going to keep their shipping highly pollution related because your first class politicians own it. Now, they don't want to tell you that. No politician wants to tell you that in order for Canada to ship the way it's shipping, that's owned exclusively by Liberals and Conservative insiders, and at the provincial level, NDP insiders in the elected and appointed first class, is all farmers and working third class are going to pay it. Whether that's through carbon pricing and direct carbon tax on your consumption outside of all the forested lands, or through equalization calculations. If Pierre Poilievre is to scrap carbon tax, he will have to make it up with the equalization formula that they have bound inside the constitutional acts of Canada against all second and third class Canadians. This is all your farmers, which have become an extreme minority in Canada over the last 75 years. We've never expanded farming, we've only shrunk it. And the amount of farmers that own farmlands in everyday citizens is astronomically shrunk. It moved from 1 in 16 to 1 in 64. In fact, corporate farms are taking over. This is absolutely the truth of Ontario and Quebec. It is slowly becoming the reality and truth of Alberta and Saskatchewan. Alberta is reducing theirs at twice the rate of Saskatchewan. It won't be long in these record immigration programs and schemes that farmers in the third class will be an extreme minority, probably 1 in 128 Canadians. That should alarm everybody, but what was talked about in COP is not represented in anything any federal or provincial politicians are talking to regular, everyday Canadians. In fact, I tell people, and what really gets me is nobody shares or nobody cares, that what they tell us is not what's reported with Standard & Poor's, Moody's and Finch, which not only grade every country that trades and runs in the USD system, they're American, they're world recognized. If they give you a bad credit rating, or they turn around and give you a poor investment prospect rating, which both are jointly together, you lose massive. Under Justin Trudeau, we've already lost massive in their ratings. And under what Pierre Poilievre has presented to them is not, and that's in writing, not what he's telling every Canadian. In fact, Scott Moe, Danielle Smith, for starters, nothing they have said is presented in those reports, or even what we just watched in COP28. Everything the delegation presented and said is not what they're telling Albertans and Saskatchewanians. Our provincial crown is going a whole different way on the global stage, which should terrify everybody, because we don't really control our exports and imports on how that's shipped out to the world. We're subject to it. Charles has a plan for us, King Charles III, who is not, and I repeat, not allowed in the UNSCP 5 or not allowed in the United Nations. So when we see Charles leading the presentation of COP28 and President Joe Biden doesn't go, President Xi Jinping doesn't go, and President Vladimir Putin doesn't go, this means that it not only is it not binding, it's not recognized by the allies of World War II who actually run the world. And folks, if you didn't know, all Canadians and First Peoples, if you didn't know how world supply and value chains are ran and who controls them, all you have to do is look at COVID-19. And I don't want to get into anti-vax, pro-vax and all that crazy cockamamie world. I want you to look at the value and supply chains. And you will find that all 5 allies of World War II, the binding world authority of international law, came together under COVID-19 and COVID vaccination, production, and value and supply chains. And what that shows you is that large and in charge was USA, Russia, and China on global shipping. UK and France tried, but they didn't come close. No other nations in all 193 nations came close on production and value and supply chains. That was a global highlight of just who runs global shipping, value and supply chains for world exports and imports by a large margin. Clearly, United States in first place, China in second, but global value and supply chains of the most nations puts Russia in third place, but technically second place in the whole world. It runs in line with OPEC plus nations versus USA and its allied nations under USD in just oil. But when you look at globally, COVID-19 showed you who runs world value and supply chains, shipping to the most nations in the world. And it's USA and then it's Russia. And when you look at population, that's tremendous, when only really they represent less than 500 million people in almost 9 billion population. That says everything about which nations are the most powerful globally. And remember, China's nearly 1.5 billion people. They have a lion's share of the world's population just nationally. So you get into domestic supply and value chains, that puts them up as a world leader. Russia clearly is second place on the global stage of most influence on most nations. Charles doesn't hold any keys to any of that. The UK hardly holds any keys to any of that. They hold financial controls and taxation controls in conjunction with the Commonwealth and the nations inside the Commonwealth, which is wrong, hypocritical, cockamamie. And I wouldn't believe a word that comes out of Justin Trudeau's mouth, Pierre Poilievre's mouth, or Jagmeet Singh's mouth, as they clearly all have sworn and stood by that. King Charles III is the most dangerous monarch since probably King George V in world history, and that's before the 5 allies of World War II. USA, Russia, and China are putting their foot down. They're not going forward in this narrative. They can't. They're limited by their constitutions. They can't. It'll turn into civil war if they try to force that or try to go against their institutions, their highest laws of the land. Americans will rebel. It's already showing in the polls. Vladimir Putin, contrary to what we're told in the West, has more than 87 nations inside of nations he represents. The obelisks and even the republics inside his dominion, his Russian Federation, that have a division of powers too. And he does not hold that power in his said federal powers to override them. and he will fall apart worse than the United States of America if he tries to forcibly take those powers away from the people in their obelisks and in their republics. And he has more to worry about and more widespread than the United States of America and their 50 states and their territories. Neither of them can legally do it. They're bound to follow the laws, and if they don't, people will rebel. And we're not told this in the West, or especially in European unitary states, monarchies like Canada attached to the crown of the United Kingdom. We have Scotland today ready to break free from the UK. They're presenting leaving the UK in the idea of going to the European Union and having their own equal say. That's getting presented. They have massive wind, successful in the North Sea. That's all Scotland's. They don't need the UK or the UK's narratives. They're not going to go in with Charles and his carbon tax. Right now he has the iron thumb because they're attached to the United Kingdom, the five-nation United Kingdom that's unitary under Charles and Sunak. It's incredible where the world's going. All of the worst dictatorships, constitutional monarchies, unitary states, civil law socialists, they're participating in carbon tax. I don't know that I believe Pierre Poilievre. Politicians are allowed to legally lie. I don't believe he's going to remove carbon tax. He may change it into something else, but it'll still be the same. I don't believe he will break from King Charles III. He swore to him. He gets his Majesty's official opposition power from that title and all the privilege it bestows. He's on Twitter the day Charles ascended, who created the Green New Deal, created carbon tax. He said, God save the king. He gets his title, his powers as a first class from that authority constitutionally. And I don't believe Pierre Poilievre's going to live up to anything he says. And if he does, he will replace carbon tax with equalization formula, really stripping Alberta and places like Alberta and Saskatchewan in our confederation to yield. If he removes carbon tax, Canadians and First Peoples, he has to 100% commit to defunding Ukraine entirely and absolutely agree to defunding Israel entirely to make up the revenue loss that's been paying Ukraine for 2 years and now has added Israel on top. I'm going to tell you, if you don't know, Israel gets 126% more than Quebec gets in Confederation in transfer from the federal government year over year in the last 2 years of this, almost 2 years of Ukrainian war. Ukraine gets more than everything Quebec gets in equalization, transfer, and carbon tax. Ukraine has gotten more. Now, with Israel, just last 2 months and the commitments Canada has made, Israel gets more than all 3 Atlantic provinces and the provinces of Manitoba by all Canadians from your carbon tax and your equalization transfers. Canadians, that's real, factual, actual, and you can see it in monetary, just in our reports from our federal budgets, our federal transfers, which is 61% of the entire federal budget. All of your deficits and debts accumulated in the last 2 years. Will Pierre commit to that? I don't believe he will. King Charles III, his great-grandfather, King Charles V, created this Israel, this problem, this finance that we have to pay. He created it, he cemented it in 1917. The last time I checked, all Canadians wear their poppy. All Canadians continually celebrate that war and the transformation of Israel and many, many other UN states into colonial crown assets that we fund till this day. We celebrate it every Remembrance Day as a good thing. USA doesn't celebrate that. They don't wear a poppy. They don't celebrate Remembrance Day or World War I. They outlawed it. They call it Memorial Day, Veterans Day. They refuse to celebrate the transfer of assets throughout the world to colonial states. It's contrary to everything that is America. It's been outlawed since 1956. And what we saw in COP28, even the Democrat president, radical Green New Deal Joe Biden, is not really going to do a Green New Deal. Obviously, he's backing out now because he didn't go to COP28. He canceled because he has to. Vladimir Putin was never going because he can't. Legally, he can't go. His nation won't let him. It's against the law in Russia's 87 obelisks and republics, just as it's against the law in the 50 states of the United States of America for Joe Biden. It's absolutely against the law in all the Chinese provinces in the communist country called China. Xi Jinping can't go, can't implement that. And they're communist anyway, so it doesn't matter, Canadians. It doesn't matter for a communist country. They're all one anyway. You can't have a preferential tax in China because everyone's the same. Right or wrong, I'm just telling you how it works. And if you look at these things, you see the validity of what I'm talking about. Carbon tax is a consumption tax of a class of citizens. It's a tax on your consumption and what you need to live. It's just another crown tax that's as old as constitutional monarchies. The crown gets paid. Canada will never get rid of that tax. They will change it. They will change it into an inequality tax through the equalization formula. Or Pierre Poilievre's going to have to say, I will no longer fund Ukraine and Israel. And until I see Pierre Poilievre stand up in Parliament and say, listen everybody, when I become Prime Minister, I'm absolutely no longer going to fund $1 to Ukraine or Israel or any other global conflicts. Until he says that, he's got a huge revenue shortfall, to the likes of which Quebec can't even match, to the likes of which the Atlantic provinces, 3 of them, plus Manitoba, can't even match. Think about that. We're 40 million people, 10 provinces, 3 territories. When 2 countries drain so much revenue from you, and you're going to say, oh, I'm going to erase the source of funding for those 2 engagements Canada's in, well, then you better tell us how you're going to come up with the revenue, because Moody's and Fitch, Standard and Poor's don't see that in any report from the Conservative Party of Canada. And if they did, they would report it, and then they would lower Canada's rating on each and every party, because they do. They grade all your parties, and all your parties have to submit. They haven't submitted anything that shows anything that they're telling Canadians on CBC, CTV, Global News, City News, anywhere in Canada that remotely represents the reports of each and every political party to Standard & Poor's, Moody's and Fitch, which are the 3 credit reporting services globally for every nation in the world that trades and is bound in USD, which we are. We're a NATO country. So Pierre hasn't said any of that to any of them. Trudeau certainly has not, and neither's Jagmeet Singh. So all the things they're telling you are lies. That's all you can say they are, is lies. And maybe Pierre Poilievre's going to get rid of carbon tax, but he has to have something in place, because he hasn't presented that to Standard & Poor's, Moody's and Fitch. And I believe them because they've been deadly truthful, our politicians and our political parties, to those global graders of nations' credit rating worthiness and absolutely their investment worthiness. And they're not reporting that. So somebody's lying. I know for certain it isn't them. That's my video. Share, share, share. Know that 318 billion trees, 30% of the global forestation in the world that's in Canada, was not talked about once by King Charles III, Greta Thunberg, or any Canadian delegation, federally, His Majesty's opposition, or absolutely any provincial crown delegation, which there was a multitude of them, including Scott Moe's and Daniel Smith's. Why didn't you defend farmers there? Why didn't you tell them about your massive crown forests? Because you're in it. You're in it to destroy us. That's my video. Share, share, share. Get it out there. Huge, massive, very important. I know.